Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Another Place, Another Time, Chapter 12, Prisoner of War. My last duties on board U-190 ended on May 14th, 1945, and I was officially no longer an active officer in the Kriegsmarine but a prisoner of war in the Royal Canadian Navy. I was to remain a prisoner for nearly 26 months, a period of my life that was both interesting and frustrating. I shall commence the story of this part of my life by returning to my personal account. It reads: May 14th, 1945. Our men now come up through the hatch and look around at their new environment. They are obviously glad that this kind of operation is over. They had very little sleep during recent days as the lack of a full crew made itself felt. One of the last officers to come aboard, a lieutenant in the special service, speaks German fluently without any accent. Only rarely does he search for the right German word. When I ask him about this, he tells me that he studied at the University of Hamburg until 1938 and that he is now acting as an interpreter. I'm told to stay aboard together with my two chief petty officers, whereas the remainder of my crew are to join their comrades aboard the escort vessels. In the meantime, more Canadian Navy personnel have come aboard. They are trained in submarine operations and, in contrast to their friends from the escort vessels, are very impressive. I am interrogated with respect to our boat. They ask only general questions and then want me to demonstrate our diesels. I decline with the explanation that it is a job for more people than just me, and in addition, they wouldn't be able to remember the procedures anyway. After all, a German crew goes through a training period of 6 months and more, so the questions come to a quick end. The officers who boarded us at sea now return to their respective vessels and one by one approach me to say goodbye. Everyone offers a firm handshake with best wishes and assurance that I will probably be home in 6 months at the latest. They try to console me about becoming a prisoner of war and express confidence that we will be treated very well in the camps. I'm not so sure about all of this. Dean regrets that he can't offer me his bathtub as promised, as I won't be coming to his ship. He assures me that none of our personal belongings have been taken by his men since they were all searched. Coming up to the bridge of U-190 again, I find myself face to face with Herbert Rogge, the first officer of the watch. After a lively exchange of greetings and back-slapping, he informs me that he has come aboard with a small detail to collect the belongings of the entire crew. The other crew members will not be allowed back on our boat. While we are packing the personal effects of our officers, he tells me a bit about the happenings of the last days. They didn't suffer any more than I did, but received very decent treatment, comfortable quarters, and good food. To my question, what's going to happen to us now, he tells me that our crew has been transferred to another frigate, the Prestonian, and that we will be taken to Halifax, whereas our boat will remain here. We spend a long time talking while trying to consume as much of the remaining canned fruit as possible, and a few Canadians participate. All our luggage is now loaded on a boat that has come alongside. We are standing on our aft deck and take a last look at our U-190. Then we step into a small boat and are taken to the frigate HMCS Prestonian. The weather has turned beautiful again. It's warm, it smells like spring, the sun is shining, and against the blue sky we see an airplane. Strange to be able to listen to the noise of a plane without getting a somewhat uncomfortable feeling, something we had become very used to in Germany. A Catalina circles overhead quite harmlessly. After we come alongside the Prestonian, Rogge and his people go aboard immediately, while I and my two chief petty officers still have to wait. All around us are people who stare at us as if we were one of the wonders of the world and take a lot of pictures. I'm amazed how many people inhabit this little village. But we do look a bit wild. The chief petty officers in their grey leather jackets and I, though in my blue coat with a red kerchief and a 12-week-old beard. Then we follow a few sailors on board the frigate. On our way below decks, we passed through 2 rows of heavily armed soldiers and I can't help smiling. I don't think we are nearly as dangerous as they seem to think we are. Then we have to empty our pockets, but I am allowed to keep everything, even my pocket knife. I want to digress briefly to comment on a legend that has arisen from the circumstances of the surrender of U-190. This event attracted considerable attention as the numerous photographs taken at the time, many of which are included here, attest. For years after the war ended, eyewitnesses who were supposedly present when our crew was searched claimed that streetcar and cinema tickets from Halifax were found in their pockets, proof that we had secretly gone ashore in Canada during our last patrol. As late as 1989, a reputable Canadian magazine printed a letter from a veteran of the RCN who insisted that when he searched us, he found not only the proverbial streetcar tickets, but also Canadian cigarettes, Canadian-made rubber boots, maps of Canadian cities, and even pictures of Canadian girls that crew members had dated in Halifax. As if this was not ludicrous enough, the same correspondent claimed that some of these sailors from U-190 had grown up in Canada and spoke fluent English. Such statements are pure invention, the product of an overactive imagination, and worse still, this myth has been compounded and exaggerated over the years, and the story has grown in the telling. Yet, this legend of the German U-boat sailors who went ashore in Halifax simply refuses to die and can still be encountered. Let me resume my narrative. Our next destination is Prestonian sickbay, where a medical officer asks me about any illnesses, and after my negative reply, I am reunited with the officers of our boat in a small officer's cabin. They are in a great mood, and the loud bidding of their card game shows that they feel quite at home. My two chiefs have been put together with the rest of the crew. We move over to the officer's wardroom after it has been cleaned up. It's quite comfortable, but very wartime Spartan. The first thing that hits our eyes is an enormous portrait of our special friend, Mr. Churchill. Quickly, an animated conversation develops between the ship's officers and ourselves, and we get along just fine. They are all university students and somewhat older than us. We are offered Coca-Cola and cigarettes. We notice the ports being closed, and soon we hear the hum of the engines and feel the motion of the sea. We are underway. For lunch, we join the captain of the frigate, and his officers take a later sitting. We are amazed about the rich variety of food, and in the afternoon we are taken back on deck to pick up our bags from the big heap belonging to our crew. We are asked to open the bags, and after a rather superficial inspection, everything is taken down into a room near the officer's wardroom. Then the aforementioned interpreter, who is accompanying us, once again goes over our belongings. Several written notes are taken from us, as is my radio and a photo of a Japanese submarine in my album. "We may have some use for this," says the interpreter. Everything else, letters, pictures, etc., we can keep, including our ceremonial uniform dirks. Right afterwards, we are offered the use of a bath and the services of the ship's barber. How absolutely lovely to be clean again after 12 weeks and to have a clean-shaven face. We all feel like newborns and admire ourselves in a full-size mirror, now wearing our dress uniform. The Canadians can't believe their eyes when they see us so transformed. They claim to hardly recognize us. In the wardroom there are illustrated magazines containing many pictures of pretty girls and much anti-German invective. In our conversations with the Canadians, we talk about war and origins of war. They accuse us, that is our government, of having broken its word after the Munich Agreement when we attacked Poland. When we talk about cause and effect, the Canadians change the subject. They do everything to avoid confrontation with us and continue to assure us that we are all very reasonable people, as is probably the whole population of Germany. But the evil Nazis brought disaster to the world, and after their elimination there would be no reason at all not to get along with Germany. Then we talk about warfare at sea. They explain the methods used by their ace submarine chaser, Captain Walker, and how he achieved his successes. We in turn tell them our ways to elude the anti-submarine forces. It is an interesting dialogue between opponents who respect each other after the battle is over. The captain of the frigate, a St. Lawrence River pilot, a magnificent bearded figure, plays a game of cards with one of his officers. We watch with interest and soon understand the game of cribbage. I ask Lieutenant Fox for a game, which he promptly loses. I have incredible luck with the cards. After the 4th loss, Fox has had enough, and I can't get him to play another game for the rest of the trip. For the night, the ship's sickbay has been made available to us. Only our CO sleeps somewhere else. A steward supplies us with mattresses and blankets. He is a young guy who has seen a lot of the world. He sits with us until almost midnight and recites wondrous adventures from his life. Finally he leaves and we get some sleep. Outside there is a sentry, but he lets us walk in and out as we please. The following day is very quiet. We play cards or chess and read newspapers. In between, we have an opportunity to go up on deck for fresh air, where we meet the men of our crew. They are no worse off than we are and are in good spirits. One of them shows us a photo of himself arm in arm with a Canadian sailor. We are amazed about how fast the two groups make friends. We watch a strange-looking piece of equipment being lowered over the stern. We assume it is the infamous Kreissäge or circular power saw which made life hell for us for so many weeks. The weather is lovely, and we feel almost like being on a holiday cruise. Only the zigzag course of the frigate indicates the uncertainty of the situation, as there may still be a German U-boat lurking below the surface, having had no contact with High Command and carrying on the war on its own. Next morning, we notice that we are very close to shore. The frigate is expected to tie up at Halifax at 8 a.m., and this is the same harbor we have looked at for 5 weeks through our periscope and where we have sunk our victims. We learn that we will not tie up at a shore pier, but will make fast at a mooring buoy for the purpose of avoiding the attention of the population of Halifax, which has been informed about our arrival through the press. We are not to disembark until later in the evening. Shortly after the mooring maneuver, several high-ranking Canadian naval officers come aboard for, as we soon find out, the task of interrogating us. One after the other, we are taken to a cabin where several of the interrogators have assembled. When I enter the room, the first thing I see lying on the table is the manual containing our top-secret standing war orders issued by High Command. Are they ever well informed? They are not interested at all in military matters, but ask only questions of a political nature. I convey my ideas honestly to them, whereupon they, in lengthy elaboration, explain to me that it is now up to me to decide on which side I want to be in the coming conflict between communism and democracy. And with that, I am dismissed. The other officers have a more difficult time, especially the CO, at least according to his stories when he comes out. He must have been squeezed terribly. In the afternoon, the second watch officer Werner Müller and my engineer in training Ernst Gelenk are taken up on deck for a presentation to the press. They have interesting and amusing details to tell about the theatrical performance on deck. At 5 p.m. a small boat takes us ashore. The officers of the Prestonian bid us goodbye, and the captain assures us that all our conversations will not leave the confidentiality of the officers' wardroom. He also expresses his deep regret that the unpleasantness of a political interrogation had to take place on his ship. We have now become charges of the Canadian Veterans Guard, and our treatment by this home-based organization is much stricter than that afforded to us by our real adversaries in the war at sea. We have to laugh when we step ashore at a pier in Halifax. Several hundred heavily armed soldiers with their hands on their weapons stand in grim anticipation of what? We are not quite sure. An army of criminals? Behind the shelter of the guards is the population of Halifax, jostling for a good spot to see the Germans. We are required to open our bags and are bodily searched for concealed weapons. During this operation, my little pocket knife disappears into the big pockets of a grim-looking sergeant. I hope he's going to cut his thumb with it. The luggage is loaded on a truck. We, the officers, climb aboard one bus, and our crew boards 2 others. In a long convoy, we are driven through Halifax. Our driver, who is new in the city, loses his way, and some time goes by before a very angry officer on a motorcycle catches up with us and leads us back to the path of the righteous. We are not impressed with the sights of the city, considering its importance for Canada. We drive directly to the main station. With us is a soldier who speaks some German and eagerly tries to utilize his knowledge. At the station, we board a waiting train bound for Montreal. We officers have an entire Pullman car to ourselves, whereas our crew occupies the carriages that follow. An officer approaches us and offers us less strict treatment if we give our word of honor not to escape. We give our word of honor. After that, only 1 or 2 soldiers sit with us in a far corner of the carriage and completely ignore us. Later, we again see our well-known interrogators who will accompany us to Montreal. They occupy a little compartment of their own. About 7 o'clock, the train starts moving and rolls out of Halifax. Later during the evening, an officer asks us to follow him to dinner. We walk through several cars and end up in the dining car of the train, where we sit down at 2 tables among the Canadian civilian passengers. At first, we seem to be unrecognized as Germans, and the conductor persistently demands to see our tickets until the situation is explained to him and he leaves us in peace. Now we become subject to curious glances from the other tables, but our appetite is not adversely affected. Once again, we feel like we are in a holiday excursion, and I don't think we look all that repulsive in our dress uniforms. After dinner, we return to our car and talk until late into the night before the black Pullman porter finally makes up our beds. They are marvelously comfortable. We sleep deeply, as we haven't done in months in our narrow, hard U-boat bunks. Next morning, it is hard to believe, we stay in bed as long as we want, but then breakfast calls served by our porter. And we really enjoy the sights of the passing countryside. Endless woods alternate with vast steppes. Rarely do we see a human settlement. The train doesn't stop often. Very few people leave or board. Soon we reach the St. Lawrence River. Ponderously the waters roll along the wide river bed, and we think about the fact that some of our U-boats were able to penetrate right up to here. In the afternoon, we reach Quebec City. On the opposite riverbank, we notice a magnificent building. We learn that Roosevelt and Churchill had an important meeting there, affecting the outcome of the war. The French character of the city is notable with its inscriptions, advertisements, and signs written in the French language. A few weeks ago on our patrol, we read a book dealing with the battles between the British and the French in this area. We didn't expect to see the battlefields so soon in person. About 9 o'clock we approach Montreal, the only city with more than 1 million inhabitants in Canada. Long before our arrival, we notice the glow of its lights in the sky. The city presents an impressive sight with its brightly illuminated bridges crossing the river and the brilliance of colorful advertisements of a size and quantity we hardly knew in peacetime. We haven't seen anything like that for nearly 6 years. We change trains in Montreal. We are now separated from our crew, and only the CO receives permission to say goodbye to our men. The interrogators also leave us here, and we are turned over to the military police. A major with several soldiers takes over and leads us to a train on an adjacent track. Here, to our astonishment, we meet 3 German U-boat officers. Following our custom of saluting them arouses the ire of the major, who declares that such a salute is prohibited and warns us of dire consequences should we violate his rules. When our CO addresses him quite innocently as captain, his self-control takes a leave of absence. He almost bursts with indignation, explains that he is a major, that we are to take our hands out of our pockets when we talk to him, and if we expect to be treated correctly, we have to behave correctly. The 3 officers are from U-889. They surrendered their boat just before us. They are the chief engineer, the second watch officer, and a Kapitänleutnant who was aboard as a commanding officer trainee. This boat was still on its way to the operations area and had not seen any action. These officers had much worse experiences in comparison to us. Every piece of personal property was confiscated, and they were not treated nearly as well as we were. As we have noticed already, here blows a different wind. We are only allowed to sit on 2 specific benches, and when we have to follow a human urge, a guard comes with us and keeps an eye on us. Any conversation containing politics is strictly prohibited. While we lament this unpleasant change for the worse, our friends from U-889 claim they have never had it so good since their surrender, as now here on their journey from Shelburne to Montreal. Shortly thereafter, the train starts moving and we leave Montreal. The curtains are drawn and we are not allowed to look out of the windows. At 9 o'clock, we are ordered into our bunks. Every one of us is in an upper berth with a Canadian in the lower. The curtains must stay open and the lights are left on all night. Early in the morning, we have to get out of bed and receive breakfast in our seats, but no knives. On the front page of a newspaper somebody is carrying through the compartment, we see a picture of our 2 interviewees, Lieutenants Klenk and Müller. Our request to get a copy of the paper is passed on to the major. We finally receive the picture cut out from the paper without any text. Maybe even the major himself isn't too convinced of the reliability of newspaper reports. After a while, however, he joins us in our compartment and all of a sudden he is quite human. Very soon we carry on a lively conversation. In the early afternoon we reach our goal, Gravenhurst in the province of Ontario. It's a small but well-known tourist town. On a handcart we transport our substantial luggage through the station to a truck which takes us to Camp 20, a few miles outside the town. After a quarter of an hour we arrive at the barracks where we are subjected to another inspection of our luggage and a search of ourselves. This time we lose our naval dirks. We approach a high fence and the barbed wire fence closes behind us. We wonder for how long. We need not have worried because Camp 20 turned out to be a very pleasant place. Built around a former tuberculosis sanatorium near the shore of a lovely lake, it had all the comforts of life with the exception of female company. And we prisoners were treated like guests of the country. We had our own dance band, playing mainly big band swing music, our own symphony orchestra, our own internal university, and 6 first-run American films every week, which in summer were shown under the trees. There was a library with about 3,000 books of all categories in many languages, with bookbinding equipment to repair damaged volumes. We had a tennis court inside the barbed wire, while outside there were 2 hockey rinks and our own fenced-off swimming area in nearby Lake Muskoka with diving tower and water polo basin. Farther away, we had a farm with chickens, pigs, horses, potato fields, and maple trees. Eaton's catalog challenged us to splurge our financial allowance, which was $20 a month. A beer ration was provided officially by the Canadian authorities, but spirits were produced illegally and our still was protected by an elaborate alarm system. I can't imagine any tourist resort being busier than Camp 20. The typical response of any prisoner you wanted to talk to was, "Sorry, I'm busy. See me tomorrow sometime." And then he hurried off to his next activity. Despite our worries about conditions in Germany, the general mood in the camp was similar to that at a modern resort. Conversations between Monday and Thursday dealt almost completely with the bridge tournament that had taken place the previous Sunday. On virtually any Friday evening, after allocation and the trading back and forth of our beer ration, you could find a rousing party that went on into the morning, when the hangovers were cured with some more beer. Rogge, Müller and I from U190 spent weeks converting our room into an authentic dimly lit North European harbour tavern with fishing nets covering the ceiling, fishing implements on the walls, nautical lanterns swinging from above. I have no idea where we got all that stuff from. And then invited our friends, with the exception of our CO Oberleutnant Reit, who was not among them, all of whom had saved at least 4 weekly rations of beer amounting to about a gallon each. How many uninvited guests came, and they filled the room to overflowing, is not known. The reverberations lasted for months, and everybody talked about the U190 party of the year. For the activities outside the barbed wire, like hockey, swimming or visiting the farm, we had to leave the camp perimeter and therefore had to give our parole not to escape. We did this by presenting a wooden tag with our name and signature on it at the main guardhouse. Our outside behavior was, of course, governed by certain regulations. Our signature was given back to us when we returned, and it was commonly accepted wisdom that as long as our signature and our word of honor was with the guards, we were as safe to our captors as any mechanical means could make us. As soon as we got our signatures back, all bets with respect to escape were off. Every morning our farmers assembled outside the gate and were accompanied by a few guards on the half-hour march to the farm. There the prisoners had built a log farmhouse for protection from inclement weather. At lunchtime, the guards delivered the camp's meal by jeep. Many tasks had to be looked after, including feeding and caring for the 3 horses and the 100 chickens, planting and harvesting vegetables and potatoes. But one could get also involved in a game of soccer or get away from it all by having a leisurely hour-long walk around the farm. Another activity was collecting maple sap in a nearby sugar bush. For the few weeks we tended to the containers at the trees, shipped them to the camp with the guard's jeep, and spent many hours day and night stirring the sap in enormous kettles over the fires in the kitchen until it had evaporated enough to become syrup and was a welcome addition to our breakfast. The day at the farm ended in the evening when, after roll call, the guards led us back to the camp. One event occurred at Gravenhurst that was perhaps not so pleasant, but in retrospect was necessary. During the last 2 patrols of U190, the relationship between the boat CO, Oberleutnant zur See Hans-Edwin Reit, and his officers had seriously deteriorated due to Reit's indecisiveness and his inability to control difficult situations, combined with an ever-increasing pomposity. After our arrival in Camp 20, the officers of U190, that is, the first watch officer Oberleutnant zur See Herbert Rogge, the second watch officer Leutnant zur See Werner Müller, the engineer in training Leutnant Ernst Gelenk, and myself petitioned the Lagerführer, the German senior officer at Gravenhurst, Oberst Maythaler, to formally dissolve the command relationship between Reit and the officers of U190. As a matter of fact, we had lost all respect for the man and found it distasteful in the extreme to have to salute him. A subsequent board of inquiry held at Gravenhurst resulted in the granting of our request with an option to reopen the matter of Reit's behavior if there should ever be an opportunity within a new German Navy. There was no more social intercourse between Reit and us, and I never exchanged any communication with the man after that time. Although Germany had surrendered and the war was over, life in Gravenhurst continued much as it had before May of 1945. We did have a few characters, like a certain Hauptmann Hamacher in the camp who, immediately after hostilities ended, took off their uniforms and asked the more junior officers not to salute them and to address them with the familiar "du", etc. The vast majority of us had nothing but contempt for such behavior. Unfortunately, for the would-be civilians, their initiatives were squashed when the Canadian commandant addressed us and made it quite clear that as long as we were at Camp 20, we were German officers and he expected us to behave as such, including wearing uniforms and medals. Since the war, some commentators have exaggerated these small and quite unimportant acts of personal behavior into a general description of imagined conflicts in the camps, but such a portrayal is not accurate. There were some strange people in the camp, as there are in any collection of human beings anywhere, and one just had to get used to them. As far as most of us were concerned, our war would be over when we finally went home, and until then we continued to behave as officers. We were all shocked after we were exposed to evidence of the concentration camp horrors and the Holocaust. For many weeks we denied that these things could have taken place under German authority, and some of us ascribed this information to well-honed Allied propaganda. Knowing how in Germany we had been subjected to very effective and skillful wartime propaganda, we felt that here in Canada we were being exposed to more of the same, and that the horrors we were now being told about had no greater credibility. We discussed the matter among ourselves and decided that the truth seemed to lie on a path straight through the middle of the contrasting claims. Finally, most of us came to accept this shameful chapter in the history of Germany, and thus had to learn how to carry a burden that would remain with us for the rest of our lives. Not having known of these atrocities during the war did, however, allow us to live with our own personal consciences in respect to having fought for Germany, not for the regime that carried out these unspeakable horrors. Because of the immediate post-war conditions in our war-ravaged homeland, mail from Germany ceased during the first few months after our arrival at Gravenhurst. When it resumed, I received one of the first letters, and it was from Ruth, an event that was one of the big surprises of my life. I had no idea how she found out that I was still alive and a prisoner in Canada. We began to correspond regularly, and this exchange nourished our hope for a happy reunion in Germany, whenever that may be. Our relations with our Canadian captors were always very good. As an example, I should mention our camp interpreter, Captain Michael Kramchenko, and his contribution to amity between former enemies. When we finally began to receive passes from home, they were examined by the camp staff, who were somewhat puzzled by the fact that so many prisoners were receiving bottles labeled hair tonic, which, of course, entered without problems and provided the recipients with a nice dose of schnapps. It did not take long for the staff to figure out what was going on, and such containers began to be tested. On one occasion, when Captain Kramchenko was the tester, he opened a number of suspect bottles, sniffed the contents, and pronounced clearly, "This is hair tonic," and the schnapps continued on to the grateful recipients. Kramchenko was an engaging man whose sense of humor reverberated throughout the camp. During the time I spent at Gravenhurst, all of us in the camp were anxious for our repatriation to Germany. In the meantime, we kept busy. Since many of the prisoners were reserve or wartime-only officers and had civilian professions, a very effective university had been created in the camp, and there were very few disciplines that did not have courses given by experts in their fields. The products of our forestry classes were visible outside the former camp for many years afterwards. A number of these POW courses were granted a credit at some German universities. I took lessons in mathematics and physics to prepare for my own professional development after my return home. In June of 1946, however, our idyllic existence came to an end when we learned that we were to be transferred to a camp in Britain. Our response to a survey made a few months before, in which the majority of all prisoners voiced their desire to remain in Canada instead of returning to Germany, had been ignored. Our beloved boat, the U-190, did remain behind and, as we learned much later, had an interesting post-war career. It was commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy as His Majesty Canadian Submarine U-190 and used for evaluation and trials. Its first voyage under the White Ensign was a publicity tour of the ports along the St. Lawrence River in August of 1945, and thousands of fascinated Canadians waited in line for hours to get an opportunity to visit a German U-boat, an authentic grey wolf of the sea, about which they had heard so much during the war. HMCS U-190 continued in Canadian service until July of 1947, when it was declared surplus and paid off. Rather than ending its life in a scrapyard, our boat came to a more spectacular end. On Trafalgar Day, October 21st, 1947, U-190 was towed to approximately the same position where HMCS Esquimalt had been sunk in April of 1945 to become the target in Exercise Scuppered. The plan for this event called for Canadian naval aircraft, Fireflies armed with rockets and Seafires armed with bombs, to attack U-190, which would be followed by gunfire from two Tribal-class destroyers, HMCS Haida and Nootka, which would actually sink our old boat. As it was going down, an escort vessel would then administer the coup de grace by firing headshock depth charges. As it happened, matters got somewhat confused. The destroyers opened fire first and straddled the boat, and then the Fireflies attacked with rockets, after which U-190 sank rapidly, stern first. It now lies on the ocean floor, not far from its former opponent, HMCS Esquimalt. To return to Camp 20 in the evening of June the 10th, 1946, we were marched to the railway station in Gravenhurst to board a train. We travelled via North Bay and Montreal to Halifax, where we arrived 2 days later and there boarded the liner Aquitania for the voyage across the Atlantic. This ship had served as a troop transport during the war, and we lived in stacked bunks in the holds but were allowed on deck a few times each day. On this voyage I met one of our most famous U-boat aces, Fregattenkapitän Otto Kretschmer, who was taken prisoner after his boat, U-99, had been sunk in early 1941. When we stepped ashore in Southampton in England, we quickly learned that the British had a different attitude than the Canadians toward German prisoners. I was not wearing my decorations, but those who did had them rudely ripped off their uniforms by a grim-looking sergeant when they came down the gangway. England, of course, had suffered much more than North America during the war, and this attitude was perhaps understandable. We were loaded into a train that took us to a camp near Sheffield, where we spent several months in drafty Nissen huts, mostly in pouring rain, before being shifted to other camps, and finally, in February of 1947, we were settled at Llanmartin, near Newport in Wales. There we were allowed to leave the camp for walks, but were told not to fraternize with British civilians. About this time, the effects of wartime suffering in England seemed to abate, and our treatment by the authorities became much more relaxed, although our food remained rather plain and just sufficient to prevent starvation. We often thought wishfully of Camp 20 at Gravenhurst. The order not to fraternize was disobeyed by both British and Germans. One day, my former engineer in training, Ernst Klenk, and I met an Englishman who told us that he owned a Jaguar car, but that he could not drive it as its motor was disassembled and he did not know how to get it running. Since he could not find anyone to do the necessary work, he offered the job to 2 former U-boat engineer officers, and for 2 weeks Klenk and I walked every morning to the residence of our new employer and exchanged our uniforms for overalls he provided, because he did not want to be caught having German prisoners working for him, as this was illegal. We took the engine of the vehicle apart, cleaned it, reassembled it, installed it in the Jaguar, adjusted the ignition and turned the key. It ran most smoothly, and we informed our employer that our task was finished. But I do not think he completely trusted us, as he asked us to take the car for a test drive. The result was that 2 German officers enjoyed a fine drive through the beautiful Welsh countryside in a Jaguar and were able to report that the car ran beautifully. My British employer was highly pleased, and we became frequent guests at his house for afternoon tea. It was about this time that Howard Hughes' notorious film The Outlaw was released. It had been banned in the United States because it displayed Jane Russell's generous and lovely shape in rather scanty clothing, and also depicted her behaving in an amoral fashion. It was, however, shown in British cinemas, including the local theatre in Newport. For obvious reasons, it was of great interest to all the prisoners, starved of female company, and one day my host loaned me a suit belonging to his son, gave me the price of admission, and sent me off to Newport to satisfy my curiosity. I spent a very pleasant few hours admiring Miss Russell's physique. I was already quite familiar with the town of Newport, since a few days earlier another naval officer and I, in full Kriegsmarine uniform and in defiance of rules and regulations which forbade us entering it, had paid the place a visit. When we arrived in the downtown area, we had asked the policeman for directions to the harbor, and he showed us the way. When we arrived at the very wide entrance to the port area, we found one guardhouse on the left side and another on the right. We simply walked straight through the middle, and nobody challenged us. Newport was so full of seamen of all nationalities that our German uniforms did not attract any attention. After an hour of exploring quays and ships, we turned to go home again, and at that very moment a harbor police jeep came to a screeching halt beside us. Our concern was not justified. The policeman simply offered us a lift back to the city, and we graciously accepted. By the summer of 1947, after nearly a year in Britain, we still had no indication of when we would be permitted to return home, and I started to get very restless. All this time, Ruth and I had been corresponding and making plans for the future. She had moved to Tübingen, a university town south of Stuttgart, where she had found a job and where I hoped to study at the university. I was anxious to get back to her and my parents, so in the late summer I decided to do something about it. Throughout my childhood and youth, I had suffered from asthma when exposed to certain substances, such as dust or straw. The heating in our barracks was by coal-fired ovens, and by manipulating the exhaust gases and breathing them, I was able to manufacture a very genuine asthma attack. After I had demonstrated my clearly fading state of health to the military doctor, he became concerned and sent me for an examination to a hospital in Chepstow. By the time I arrived there, I no longer had any symptoms, but on the other hand, my claim to be very sick couldn't be totally disproved. I was therefore extremely happy to be told in September of 1947 that I was being repatriated to Germany, considerably ahead of any of my comrades from U-190. I was transferred to Hull, where I boarded a ship transporting POWs across the North Sea to Cuxhaven. Since I was the only prisoner wearing a Navy uniform instead of the normal drab prisoner garb, which had a bright red fabric disc sewn onto the back of the jacket, I was mistaken for a member of the ship's crew, which I found quite amusing. In Germany, I was forced to spend another 2 weeks in a transition camp in Munsterlager before finally being released in Dachau, the location of the infamous concentration camp. On August 20th, 1947, after more than 2.5 years of separation, Ruth was waiting at Tübingen Bahnhof when my train arrived. Our joyful reunion was complete on October the 18th, when we were married in a small village church high in the mountains of the Schwarzwald, where her parents had found a place of refuge from the turmoil of post-war Germany. At long last, after 7 years as a naval cadet, U-boat officer and prisoner, the war had ended for me and a brighter future beckoned. So I'm a bit late producing this video, among other things because Porsche has just released the new 992.2 generation 911 GT3 and GT3 Touring. Especially the green GT3 Touring has caught my eye during the presentation, and even though it is only a slight facelift, it is still a very gorgeous car to look at. This has been Garage Diaries, on with the program. Because once again, one of our authors has made it back home after being part of the U-boat force, the branch with the highest attrition rate in the German armed forces during the war. A few things to talk about in this episode. For once, we once again witnessed the treatment of German POWs in the Canadian camps. These were, as the author states, pretty much resorts. I mean, they even had a zoo. It really made a difference where you went into capture. The contrast to the Eastern Front is immense and needs no further clarification. But it is understandable, as the Russians suffered immensely during the war. Also, we learn about the conflict between Reit and the other officers. There is a footnote in the book where the author mentions that during interrogation Reit admitted to firing torpedoes at imaginary targets, just so he could turn the boat around and come back home. That explains the phantom sinkings that are described sometimes in the war diaries, and it is indeed honorless. As for our author here, he married Ruth sometime after his return and they lived happily ever after. There is one more episode to go, the epilogue, and then the book is done. In the meantime, if you want to hear our boy speak, there is a 5-minute long interview done by a Canadian school that he visited in 2009. I will link it below. Werner himself lived to the ripe old age of 96 and died in Ontario, Canada on November the 7th, 2019. So, this is it for today. Thank you for watching, consider subscribing. Until next time, cheers.